The seller stopped in front of them, crossing his arms over his chest. In the dim light, his face looked even darker, and his gaze was studying, as if he was confirming something he had long suspected. "You've come to the wrong place," he said calmly. Caleb and Edgar didn't reply, only watching him closely. "I knew I'd meet ones like you sooner or later," the seller continued, tilting his head slightly. "The world changes, but some things remain the same. Your kind always leaves traces, and I've learned how to find them." "What are you talking about?" Caleb asked hoarsely, trying not to reveal his tension. The seller smirked. "You know. You both know." Edgar exchanged a glance with Caleb, but remained silent. "I hunt those who hide among humans but are not human themselves," the seller said, stepping closer. "Those who live under a different moon, who carry power within them but don't always understand its cost." Caleb clenched his teeth. "And now what?" The seller leaned in. "Now we talk. And you'll tell me what brought you here. Because believe me, there are no coincidences in meetings like these." He straightened and studied them carefully. "I want to know why you're here. And who else might come after you." Edgar clenched his fists but remained still. A shadow of anger flickered in his eyes, but he held it back. Caleb, too, hesitated to answer. They both knew that any word spoken now could be used against them. "We are travelers," Caleb finally said, keeping his voice steady. "Just looking for a place to stay. We're not searching for anyone, not hiding from anyone." The seller slowly nodded, but his face showed no belief. "Perhaps," he drawled, "but I don't think you're naive enough to expect me to take that at face value." He tapped his fingers on the wooden table, as if considering something. Then, without changing his tone, he continued, "Tell me the truth. Willingly. Otherwise, I'll have to extract it from you by other means." Caleb smirked slightly. "What means? You wouldn't have started this conversation if you didn't have a plan." The seller tilted his head, like a hunter observing prey that had suddenly decided to fight back. "I don't need to force you to get what I want," he replied smoothly. He pulled a small pouch from his pocket and tossed it onto the ground in front of them. A silver powder spilled out, releasing a sharp, metallic scent. Caleb and Edgar instantly felt their bodies tense, their muscles buzzing with strange inner pressure. Silver. Even in this form, it affected them, draining their strength, sending their instincts into panic. "Feel that?" The seller smiled for the first time during their conversation. "Even if you haven't fully accepted your nature yet, your body already knows what to fear." Edgar hissed, clenching his fingers into a fist. "You're playing with fire, Hunter," he growled. "Do you really think you can keep us here?" The seller spread his arms. "Not at all," he said. "But I need to know who you are and what you want. And then, perhaps we can make a deal." He took a step back and, clasping his hands behind his back, added calmly, "So, who's going to start?" "The hunter and his prey." Caleb exhaled heavily. His temples pounded. The silver dust still burned his lungs, leaving a metallic taste in his mouth. He didn't want to speak, but he knew the hunter wouldn't stop. The seller didn't seem like the kind of man to leave things unfinished. "We're looking for an artifact," he finally said, staring at the hunter. "It will help my wife." The seller raised an eyebrow slightly, but remained silent, waiting for more. "Her beast is strong," Caleb continued reluctantly. "Too strong. This artifact should help her stay in control." Edgar watched his friend, but didn't interrupt. The situation was too dangerous, and any unnecessary word could doom them. The seller slowly nodded, as if weighing his next move. "Where is it?" he asked. Caleb clenched his jaw but answered, "Far away. In the mountains, beyond the northern border. We know how to get there." A thin smile appeared on the seller's lips. How interesting, they didn't speak immediately, as if formulating a new plan. Not long ago, he had intended to sell them a rare, valuable catch. Those who hunted werewolves knew the price of such prisoners. But an artifact, that was something beyond mere money. Silver was valuable. Power was priceless. Well, plans change, he finally said. He stepped over to a chest in the corner, opened it, and pulled out a pair of steel shackles. They looked sturdy, but more importantly, silver. "You will lead me to the artifact," he said calmly, tossing the shackles at their feet. "If everything goes smoothly, perhaps we can come to an agreement." Caleb gave him a cold look. "And if we refuse?" The seller shrugged. "Then you won't see the morning." Edgar chuckled darkly. "So that's how it is? Slavery?" The seller sighed, like a weary teacher dealing with slow students. "Call it whatever you like," he said. "But I need you alive. At least for now." Caleb clenched his teeth. He felt the rage rising inside him, the beastly instincts urging him to fight, to run. But reason told him otherwise. They couldn't die now. The artifact was their only chance. He picked up the shackles, feeling the cold metal against his skin. "Fine," he said quietly. "We agree." The seller nodded in satisfaction. A wise choice. Now they walked together. But they all knew this path would be filled with betrayal. The merchant easily jumped into the saddle, skillfully pulling the reins. His dark cloak fluttered slightly before settling heavily on the horse's back. Caleb and Edgar walked behind him under the hunter's watchful gaze. Their hands remained in shackles, but they weren't too restricted. Raynor knew that exhaustion and his own vigilance would do the job. The road stretched through the forest. Thick tree canopies blocked most of the light, but the night's coolness was beginning to dissipate, promising a long and grueling day. Caleb remained silent for a while, thinking. Then, quickening his pace slightly, he spoke. "Do you even have a name? Or are you just used to being called Hunter?" The merchant didn't turn his head, but a smirk touched his lips. "A name?" he drawled. "Why would you need that?" "Maybe I just want to know whose throat I'm planning to rip out," Caleb replied calmly. Raynor chuckled briefly. "Funny," he said. "You're not the first werewolf to threaten me like that." "And are they still alive?" Edgar asked in a restrained tone. "No," Raynor replied curtly. Caleb studied him carefully. "So, you really hate us?" The merchant turned his head slightly, casting a quick glance at him. "Hatred takes too much effort," he answered indifferently. "I simply consider you dangerous." "To whom?" Caleb pressed on. "To the whole world," the hunter said coldly. They walked in silence for a while. Caleb's and Edgar's heavy footsteps were muffled by the forest floor, while the horse's hooves tapped softly against the damp earth. "Still, what's your name?" Caleb asked again. The merchant hesitated for a moment, then finally answered. "Raynor." Edgar snorted. "Sounds snake-like." Raynor only smirked but said nothing. The conversation gradually faded. Caleb realized that this man wouldn't change his attitude. He saw them as beasts, as a threat that needed to be controlled. But if Raynor thought things would stay that way, he was gravely mistaken. The journey was long and exhausting. They walked until late at night, and even when the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Raynor didn't rush to stop. The forest grew darker, the air colder. Caleb's and Edgar's feet were soaked from the damp ground and low grass, their boots covered in mud. Each step sent a dull ache through their souls, but stopping wasn't an option. At last, Raynor made a decision. "We camp here." He dismounted, picked a relatively dry spot between the trees, and began setting up his sleeping area. Quickly and skillfully, he built a small shelter from branches, draping his cloak over the frame to block the wind. Caleb and Edgar, however, received no such comfort. They were simply pointed to a spot by a large tree where the ground was slightly less damp. "Hope you've got warm fur," Raynor smirked as he sat by the fire. Caleb didn't reply, just sank onto the ground, stretching out his aching legs. Edgar sat beside him, wrapping his arms around his knees. They silently watched the hunter eat and then wrap himself in his cloak, settling into his makeshift shelter. "We need to figure out a way to escape," Edgar whispered once Raynor's measured breathing filled the shanty. Caleb nodded, but remained silent. He had been thinking the same thing. But all their plans hit the same obstacle, the shackles. Without their hands free, they couldn't attack, light a fire, or even keep warm. "If only we could get loose," Edgar murmured. "We can't," Caleb replied dryly. Silence fell again. The night was long, cold, and filled with the frustrating realization that, for now, they had no chance of escaping. At night, as the forest filled with strange rustling sounds and the darkness thickened, Caleb couldn't shake thoughts of Chloe. He imagined her at that very moment, perhaps tending to a fire at the camp, keeping watch, occasionally glancing at the sky, where the stars shimmered just like they had when they used to watch them together. The merchant easily jumped into the saddle, skillfully pulling the reins. His dark cloak fluttered slightly before settling heavily onto the horse's back. Caleb and Edgar walked behind him, under the watchful gaze of the hunter. Their hands remained in shackles, but they could still move freely. Raynor knew that exhaustion and his own vigilance would do the job. The road stretched through the forest. The thick canopy of trees let in little light, but the nighttime chill had already begun to dissipate, promising a long and grueling day. Caleb was silent for a while, lost in thought. Then, quickening his pace slightly, he spoke. "Do you even have a name? Or are you just used to being called Hunter?" The merchant didn't turn his head, but a smirk played on his lips. "A name?" he drawled. "Why would you care? Maybe I just want to know whose throat I'm going to rip out," Caleb replied calmly. Raynor chuckled briefly. "Funny," he said. "You're not the first werewolf to make that kind of threat." "And are they still alive?" Edgar asked dryly. "No." Raynor cut him off. Caleb studied him closely. "So you truly hate us?" The merchant turned his head slightly, casting him a short glance. "Hatred takes too much effort," he replied indifferently. "I simply see you as dangerous." "Dangerous to whom?" Caleb persisted. "To the whole world," the hunter said coldly. For a while, they walked in silence. Caleb and Edgar's heavy footsteps were muffled by the forest floor, while the horses' hooves clattered softly on the damp earth. "Still, what's your name?" Caleb asked again. The merchant hesitated for a moment, then finally answered. "Raynor." Edgar snorted. "Sounds snake-like." Raynor only smirked, but said nothing. The conversation gradually faded. Caleb realized that this man would not change his attitude. He saw them as beasts, as a threat that needed to be controlled. But if Raynor thought things would stay that way, he was gravely mistaken. The journey was long and exhausting. They walked until late into the night, and even when the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Raynor didn't hurry to stop. The forest grew darker and the air colder. Caleb and Edgar's feet were soaked from the damp ground and low grass, their boots caked in mud. Every step throbbed with dull pain, but stopping was not an option. Finally, Raynor made a decision. "We'll camp here." He dismounted, chose a relatively dry spot between the trees, and began setting up his shelter. Swiftly and skillfully, he built a small lean-to from branches, draping his cloak over its frame to shield himself from the wind. Caleb and Edgar, however, received no such comfort. They were simply pointed to a spot by a large tree where the ground was slightly less wet. "I hope you have warm fur," Raynor smirked, settling by the fire. Caleb said nothing, just sank to the ground, stretching out his aching legs. Edgar sat beside him, wrapping his arms around his knees. They silently watched as the hunter ate and then wrapped himself in his cloak, curling up in his makeshift shelter. "We have to find a way out," Edgar whispered once Raynor's steady breathing filled the lean-to. Caleb nodded, but remained silent. He had been thinking the same thing. But all their plans hit one obstacle: shackles. Without their hands, they couldn't attack, light a fire, or even keep warm. "If only we could free ourselves," Edgar murmured. "We can't," Caleb said flatly. They fell silent again. The night was long, cold, and filled with the frustrating realization that for now, they had no chance to escape. During the night, as strange rustlings filled the forest and darkness thickened, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about Chloe. He imagined her back at the camp, perhaps preparing something, tending the fire, occasionally glancing at the sky where the stars shimmered just as they had when they watched them together. He always worried about her, especially when he was far away. Every time they went on expeditions, Chloe stayed behind in the camp, and though her powers were great, as was her will to survive, Caleb couldn't shake his anxiety. He was certain that her bright soul and strong spirit would help her overcome any hardships. But now, with his life hanging by a thread, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen if something happened to him. How was she? Was Chloe safe? Was everything in the camp all right? Was there someone to look after her if he wasn't there? The thoughts wouldn't leave him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape his current predicament. He was here, a prisoner of the hunter, unsure of what would happen next. All he could do was think of Chloe, hope she was safe, and believe that someday they would meet again. Morning arrived, and the forest seemed to only just begin to awaken. Mist curled along the ground, hiding paths and twisted tree trunks. The hunter woke early, even before the first rays of sunlight pierced the thick foliage. His movements were swift and precise, like a man accustomed to long journeys and harsh conditions. He rose without making a single unnecessary sound, carefully folded his clothing, and checked his gear. Caleb, however, had not slept at all. Thoughts of Chloe, of what was happening at the camp, kept him restless. He lay there, listening to the silence around him, feeling his strength drain away. But his fear for his loved ones, especially Chloe, wouldn't let him sleep. He knew he had to find a way to escape, but despite all his efforts, nothing came to mind. And then, as the mist had yet to disperse, the hunter shattered the silence with his brisk voice. "Get up, Mutz. Time to move." The hunter swiftly gathered his belongings, slung them onto his horse, and, without waiting for Caleb and Edgar to get ready, jumped into the saddle. His animal, calm yet alert, was also prepared to continue. He knew no exhaustion and allowed himself no luxury of rest. Caleb and Edgar, despite their efforts to remain composed, couldn't help but feel the weight of their fatigue, something their pursuer did not share. Their legs ached from the long trek, their heads heavy from a sleepless night, yet something drove them forward. They followed the hunter in silence, not daring to protest. The journey was long, and the sun soon climbed higher. By morning, they found themselves in a strange, ominous place. The air was thick with dampness, and everything around them seemed abandoned. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, casting eerie silhouettes like harbingers of something unpleasant. And then, as they reached a swamp, the ground beneath them grew soft, the air humid and heavy. Stagnant water stretched out before them, filled with lifeless plants. Dry grass, lining the edges, looked withered, and between the patches of brittle reeds, black pools shimmered under the mist's veil. "This is the swamp," the hunter said, stopping. "We have to be careful here." Caleb and Edgar barely noticed as their feet began sinking into the thick, murky earth. Each step was a struggle, the swamp sucking at their boots, as if trying to pull them under. The stench of rot and decay was overpowering, but the hunter pressed forward, ignoring the encroaching filth. "Follow me," he ordered, nudging his horse ahead. He seemed to know this place, and each of his steps was deliberate and confident. He avoided the deepest patches of the swamp, leading the way like an experienced traveler. Caleb and Edgar had no choice but to follow. But the swamp was not just a wasteland. It was alive, and it was watching them. Then, from the stagnant depths, something began to rise. "Free us," Caleb shouted, struggling to break free, but the heavy mud was sucking in his legs. "We'll help you with this monster." The hunter hesitated for a moment, his fingers gripping the knife tightly, but he knew he didn't stand a chance without their help. He rushed toward them, frantically unfastening the locks, his hands trembling and covered in dirt. The locks creaked as they gave way, and in the next instant, Caleb and Edgar began to change. Their bodies trembled, muscles tensed, and in the blink of an eye, two mighty werewolves stood before the hunter instead of men. Their eyes burned with determination, and their clawed paws dug into the wet ground. The monster paused for a moment, as if assessing its new opponents. Its enormous paws rose slowly, droplets of swamp water streaming down its body, creating a deep, monotonous sound. "We split up," Caleb growled, wasting no time as he lunged toward the beast, drawing its attention. Edgar grabbed a withered tree, tore it from the ground, and swung it like a club, striking the monster with all his strength. The blow was powerful, but the creature only staggered. Its body was as tough as the roots of an ancient oak. The hunter didn't stand idle. He quickly scanned the area, and his eyes locked onto a small hill where a pale stone gleamed through the swampy muck. He realized this could be the heart of the swamp, the source of the creature's power. "I'll try to destroy its power. Hold it off," he shouted, dashing toward the hill. Caleb and Edgar sprang into action. They leaped around the monster, striking at it, but the creature fought back. Its movements were slow but powerful, each one carrying lethal force. At that moment, the hunter reached the hill. He gripped his knife and drove it into the stone with all his might. The swamp seemed to groan. The earth trembled, and the creature let out a deep, guttural roar. Its body began to crack, chunks of moss and dirt crumbling away as if shedding its shell. It took another step, but with less certainty. Its movements weakened, as though the swamp itself was releasing it. Seeing this, Caleb wasted no time. He delivered the final blow. His mighty clawed paw struck the monster's chest, and with one last deep growl, the creature crumbled into pieces, dissolving into a pool of swampy sludge. Silence. Only the faint plopping of water echoed as droplets fell into the murky depths. The hunter panted heavily, still gripping his knife. "Did we win?" Edgar asked, shifting his gaze between Caleb and the hunter. Caleb stared at the spot where the monster had just stood. "I think so," he replied. Yet the swamp remained dark and ominous. Perhaps this was only one of its many spawns. The eerie silence hanging over the swamp felt unnatural, as if nature itself was holding its breath, processing the outcome of the battle. Caleb slowly straightened, his body still humming with adrenaline. Edgar moved closer, his claws still clenched, eyes darting around, expecting another attack. The hunter, breathing heavily, sank to one knee. His hands were covered in mud, and the knife trembled in his grip. He looked at the two werewolves, realizing that without them, he would already be dead. "If that was only one guardian," he muttered. "What else lurks in this cursed place?" Caleb merely frowned in response. The swamp was slowly stirring. Water that had once been still began to ripple lazily. The mist thinned, revealing a path deeper into its heart. Yet the air didn't feel lighter. On the contrary, it was thick with a suffocating energy that sent shivers down their spines. "We can't stop now," Caleb said, shaking the damp fur from his shoulders. "If there was one guardian, we must be close to something important." Edgar examined the monster's remains, thick swamp sludge, oozing back into the ground. Something gleamed within it. He bent down and pulled out a small stone, resembling a crystal, entwined with tendrils of dark energy. This wasn't just a creature, he murmured, studying the artifact. It was part of something greater. The hunter rose to his feet, still feeling the tremors in his legs. "If we go further, there's no turning back," he warned, though his voice carried no fear. Caleb and Edgar exchanged glances. They had already known from the very beginning. There was no turning back for them. "Then we move forward," Caleb said, and the three of them stepped into the darkness of the swamp, unaware of what awaited them next. The hunter's heartbeat quickened. He was an experienced warrior, accustomed to danger, yet now he felt trapped. Caleb and Edgar, once bound in chains, now towered over him, their beastly eyes glinting in the darkness. "Why are you still trailing after us, Hunter?" Caleb sneered, gripping the artifact in his claw. "It's not yours anymore." Edgar smirked, narrowing his eyes. "We are no longer under your control," he added. "So maybe you should turn around and walk away while you still can." A cold sweat trickled down the hunter's back. He knew that these two could tear him apart in an instant. Without chains, without restraints, they had become a far greater threat to him than any swamp beast. But he couldn't just leave. The artifact was the key to something he had been searching for his entire life. "You don't understand," he began, struggling to find the right words. "This artifact, it's not just a source of power. It can disrupt the balance. If you don't know how to use it—" "Oh, we know exactly how to use it," Caleb interrupted, stepping closer. His claws sank into the muddy ground. "And we won't let you chain us again." The hunter took a step back. "Listen, I'm not your enemy, aren't you?" Edgar bared his fangs. "You dragged us here in chains, threw us to the monster, and waited for us to die. And now you expect us to trust you?" Hunter swallowed. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have freed you," he forced out. Caleb narrowed his eyes, a shadow flickering in their depths. "Or maybe you were just scared you couldn't handle it alone." The hunter didn't answer. He knew that every word he spoke could be his last. The silence between them grew heavier. Somewhere in the distance, a hoarse cry of a swamp bird echoed, but even that couldn't ease the tension. Edgar took a step forward. "If you stay with us, Hunter, know this. You are no longer a master, just another traveler. And if you try to betray us—" He didn't finish his sentence. Instead, he clenched a dried tree trunk in his clawed hand, and it splintered into shards. The hunter nodded, masking his unease behind a strained smile. Understood. But deep inside, he knew they wouldn't let him go so easily. And now, the hunter himself was caught in the very trap he had once set for others. The swamp remained dark and grim. Despite their victory over the monster, a sense of unease clung to the hunter. He followed Caleb and Edgar, watching as they, even in their human forms, moved effortlessly, as if exhaustion meant nothing to them. They no longer spoke to him, only exchanging glances with each other. The hunter felt the tension, primal, predatory. They didn't trust him, and why should they? "They could kill me at any moment." He sighed but showed no sign of worry. "We need to get out of here." He finally broke the silence. The swamp may still hide more creatures, and after destroying that one, he gestured toward the place where the beast had dissolved. The balance might be broken. Caleb smirked. "Afraid the swamp will take its revenge?" "I'm afraid of what I don't understand," the hunter muttered. "And you?" "I fear nothing anymore," Caleb replied with a cold grin. Edgar said nothing, but his gaze was heavy. They moved forward. The swamp seemed to close in around them. The fog thickened, the air grew heavier, and every shadow in the distance looked like a frozen figure. The water beneath their feet bubbled, whispering something in an ancient tongue. "It's alive," Edgar murmured. "What?" the hunter asked. "The swamp," he replied. "It's watching us." Caleb nodded. "We killed its guardian, but it still lingers." The hunter swallowed. He knew that werewolves sense the world differently than humans. Their connection to nature was stronger. And if they said the swamp was alive, then it was. Then we need to move faster, he said. But at that moment, the ground beneath them trembled. The swamp shuddered like a living organism, and bony hands began rising from the water. What the? The hunter pulled out his knife, but realized it was useless. Figures emerged from the swamp. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Rotten, covered in moss and algae, their empty sockets stared ahead. Their lips moved, but no sound came out. Those who perished in this swamp, Edgar rasped. It doesn't release the dead. Caleb clenched his fists. Then we'll have to make it. The figures moved toward them. The swamp had awakened. And now it demanded a new sacrifice. Without hesitation, Caleb and Edgar transformed. Their bodies once again became covered in thick fur, their claws lengthened, and their eyes glowed amber. The hunter stepped back. The werewolves looked truly terrifying. But his fear was nothing compared to the threat rising from the swamp. The dead did not hurry. They moved slowly but inevitably, as if the swamp itself pushed them forward. Their bodies were half decayed, but that didn't stop them from reaching for the living. Faint whispers escaped their mouths, echoing in the water. You have come where you should not have. You have disturbed the swamp's peace. You will stay here forever. Caleb snarled and lunged forward, his claws tearing through the nearest corpse. But it made no sound. Its body simply crumbled into the water as if it had never existed. Yet new figures were already rising to take its place. It's useless. Edgar roared, dodging grasping fingers. They're not alive. You can't kill them. Then what do we do? Caleb barked back. The hunter scanned the surroundings. He could feel it. The swamp itself decided who stayed and who left. It wouldn't let them go so easily after they destroyed its guardian. We need to find the center, he said, the source of its power. If we destroy it, maybe all of this will vanish. Are you sure? Caleb barely dodged a corpse that almost grabbed his throat. No, the hunter shouted, but we have no other choice. Edgar surged forward, forcing his way through the horde of the dead. His claws shredded the shadows, but they reappeared behind him. He howled in fury but kept moving, relying on his instincts. There, he pointed to something ahead, hidden in the mist. Amid the murky water and twisted roots, a black stone towered, etched with ancient symbols. It pulsed with a pale glow, like the swamp's own beating heart. Caleb didn't hesitate. He rushed toward it, leaving the hunter and Edgar behind. But as soon as he was within a few steps of the stone, the swamp trembled. Thick roots shot up from the water, writhing like serpents. They coiled around Caleb's legs, dragging him downward. No, he roared, but the roots were already pulling him into the depths. Edgar sprinted to help, but at that moment, something massive rose from the water. A new guardian. It was larger than the last, its body not of rot, but of stone and tangled roots. In its eyes burned the same eerie glow as the stone. The swamp won't let us go. The hunter exhaled, gripping his knife. They had awakened something even more powerful, and now they had only one chance, to destroy the stone before it was too late. But how could they do that when the swamp itself stood in their way? Caleb growled and lunged upward, straining every muscle, but the roots held him tight. The swamp was alive, its grip as strong as iron. Edgar darted to his side, his claws slicing through the wooden binds, but they instantly regrew, as if eager to consume the werewolf. Hold on, Edgar roared, grabbing Caleb's paw and yanking with all his might. The hunter, albeit reluctantly, rushed to help as well. He drew his hunting knife and slashed at the roots. This time, something changed. Cracks spread from the cut, and the roots began to crumble with a dry snap, as if rotted from within. Caleb finally broke free. He collapsed onto the mud, breathing heavily, but wasted no time.
Run.
Before the swamp grabs us again. The three of them bolted forward, pushing through the sticky mire. With each step, the sludge pulled them deeper, but they kept moving. The dead tried to block their way, but Caleb and Edgar cleared the path with claws and powerful strikes, casting the ghostly figures aside. The Guardian loomed before them, its massive form moving slowly but inexorably. It raised a stone limb and slammed it into the ground. A shockwave rolled through the swamp, causing the earth to heave and scattering them in different directions. Caleb was the first to rise. He saw the stone just a few steps away, but the Guardian was already moving toward it, its eyes glowing like molten embers. "We need to distract it," Edgar shouted. "It'll handle it," the hunter said, tightening his grip on the knife. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else driving him at that moment. The werewolves exchanged glances, but there was no time to argue. "Do whatever you want, just do it fast," Caleb snarled before leaping at the Guardian, sinking his claws into its rocky body. Edgar followed, circling the monster, striking where he could, trying to throw it off balance. Meanwhile, the hunter rushed toward the stone. He could feel the air around it trembling with raw power. He raised his knife and plunged it straight into the heart of the stone. A deafening crack echoed, as if the earth itself had shuddered. The stone erupted with blinding light, fractures spreading across its surface like lightning. The Guardian froze. Its eyes flared one last time before its body crumbled like dried clay. The swamp howled. The water churned, trees groaned, and the dead dissolved into dust. The hunter staggered back, unable to believe his eyes. The stone continued to crumble, its light fading. Caleb and Edgar, panting heavily, turned to the hunter. "Well, Hunter," Caleb wiped blood from his cheek with a claw, "looks like you were useful after all." "Not my first time," the hunter rasped, sheathing his knife. The swamp fell silent. It no longer tried to hold them back. And now they had a chance to leave. But what if this was only a fragment of what lurked in its depths? Night was nearing its end when Caleb, Edgar, and the hunter, filthy, exhausted, and drenched to the bone, finally emerged from the cursed swamp. Their clothes were ruined, their bodies covered in deep scratches, and their stomachs ached with hunger. The swamp lay behind them, but its eerie breath still lingered in the air, whispering ghostly echoes and leaving behind a foul mist. Caleb was the first to step onto solid ground before collapsing to his knees. He panted heavily, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake him. Edgar stumbled a few steps further before slumping against a gnarled stump. The hunter stood in silence, clutching his side where a swamp revenant had wounded him. His face was grim, but his eyes held no fear or doubt, only the heavy realization that they had been lucky to escape alive. "We did it," Caleb murmured weakly, still catching his breath. "Damn it, that was worse than I ever imagined," Edgar muttered, leaning back and staring at the sky. "The swamp nearly devoured us." The hunter silently sat by an old fire pit, left behind by some previous travelers, and rummaged through his pack. A minute later, he pulled out a couple of strips of dried meat and tossed one to Caleb, the other to Edgar. They tore into the food ravenously, manners forgotten. "I thought you'd abandon us back there," Caleb said between bites. "Once you realized you couldn't control us." The hunter smirked and shook his head. "Did I have a choice?" His voice was rough. "If I hadn't freed you, all three of us would be dead. And like it or not, I wouldn't have made it out without you." Edgar eyed him suspiciously, but was too tired to argue. For a while, they simply sat in silence, relishing the small moment of rest. The sky was beginning to lighten, and the first birds stirred in the surrounding forest. It was a long-awaited sign that the night of horrors was over. And yet, the swamp hadn't fully released them. Its whispers still echoed in their ears. It no longer pursued them physically, but the memory of those trying to drag them into its depths lingered. The dark figures, the foul waters, the ancient guardian protecting the heart of this land. Caleb ran a hand over his face, wiping away dried mud. "Do you think it's really dead?" he asked quietly, looking at the hunter. The hunter lifted his gaze, but said nothing. He wasn't sure. The swamp was alive. It breathed, moved, called to them. Maybe they had destroyed one guardian. Maybe they had disturbed the balance. But was it truly a victory? Or had they simply awakened something far worse? The important thing is, we made it out, Edgar finally said, lying back. And now I'm going to sleep. Even if this damn forest collapses, I'm not waking up. Caleb chuckled and closed his eyes. The hunter, however, remained seated, staring into the distant mist that still veiled the swamp. Something told him this story wasn't over yet. Echoes of the swamp. The forest, despite its outward friendliness, did not provide the relief they had expected. They continued forward, still feeling the sticky shadows of the past nightmare clinging to them. The swamp had released them, but the sense of unease did not fade. Caleb walked ahead, keenly listening to the sounds of nature. Edgar walked beside him, his muscles still tense, ready for any twist of fate. The hunter stayed a bit behind, his fingers clutching a small amulet he had found in the mud. It was a tiny piece of obsidian, covered with ancient symbols. It felt strangely warm, as though the swamp's energy still lingered within it. "What do you have there?" Caleb noticed his thoughtful gaze. The hunter remained silent, but when he met Caleb's persistent look, he finally opened his palm. "Found it in the mud. Don't know what it is, but I have a bad feeling about it." Edgar snorted. "A bad feeling? After what we've been through? Now every breeze makes me suspicious." Caleb frowned, looking at the amulet. He didn't know what the symbols were, but he felt there was power in this object. And that power didn't belong to them. "Maybe we should get rid of it?" Edgar suggested, but the hunter shook his head. "No. If this is part of the swamp's power, we'd better understand what it means." Caleb didn't reply, but his animal instincts told him this amulet wasn't just a fragment of an artifact. It was a beacon for something that hadn't left them alone. A long night. The sun was setting as they finally found a spot to rest for the night. The forest was growing colder, and the scent of the leaves finally overpowered the swamp stench that had seeped into their clothes. Edgar started a fire, and Caleb brought some game, a small rabbit he had caught along the way. "Not the best dinner, but it's better than swamp muck," Edgar grumbled, taking off his wet shirt. The hunter sat by the fire, thoughtfully examining the amulet. "Have you ever heard of swamp curses?" he suddenly asked. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Where's this coming from?" "There are legends." The hunter twirled the obsidian stone between his fingers. "The swamp isn't just a place where travelers drown. It's alive. And if it considers someone an enemy, it won't let go." Edgar scoffed. "Well, we left. So, it let go. Or..." Caleb looked into the darkness of the forest, where something rustled softly. "It's just waiting for the right moment." Silence hung in the air. Only the crackling of the fire could be heard. "So, what do you suggest?" Edgar asked. The hunter slowly clenched the amulet in his fist. "Tomorrow, we'll find someone who can tell us what this is." Caleb and Edgar exchanged a glance. They knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Omen. The night passed uneasily. Caleb slept in short bursts, his animal instincts preventing him from sinking into a deep sleep. Every rustle, every gust of wind made him tense. He knew the swamp might have let them go physically, but its shadows still followed them. The hunter also didn't sleep. He sat, hunched over the amulet, studying the symbols in the fading light of the fire. These weren't just random runes. He had seen them before, somewhere in old books, among pages covered with centuries of dust. Edgar, on the other hand, slept soundly. His body was recovering from the intense battle, and he refused to let troubling thoughts disturb his mind. However, even in sleep, his face remained tense, as though some hidden worry churned inside him. And then the darkness shifted. Caleb suddenly sat up, his amber eyes flashing. "Do you feel that?" he quietly asked the hunter. Caleb nodded, glancing around. The forest was eerily still. Too still. Not even the nocturnal birds were making any noise. And then Edgar sprang to his feet, his chest heaving. He was breathing heavily, as if he had just escaped from a nightmare. "What's going on?" Caleb asked. Edgar stared at him in shock, then at the hunter. I saw it," he murmured. "It wasn't just the swamp. It became part of me." Caleb frowned. "What are you talking about?" "It didn't let go of us. It's inside us." The hunter remained silent, his fingers tightening around the amulet. "A dream?" he asked. "No." Edgar ran his hand over his face, his hand trembling. "It was something more. It called to me. It wants me to come back." Caleb felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "It's a curse," the hunter said. "I knew something was off." Edgar swallowed hard, clenching his fists. "How do we get rid of it?" Caleb looked at the hunter. "You said you know where to find answers?" He nodded. "Yes. There's a place. A city known for its witches." Edgar raised an eyebrow. "Witches? They know about curses. If anyone can help us, it's them." Caleb sighed, looking into the forest's darkness. "Then we're going there. And the sooner, the better." Because he felt time was working against them. The Witch City. The journey was long and exhausting. Caleb, Edgar, and the hunter trudged through dense forests, crossed rivers, and passed through abandoned villages that had been deserted by their inhabitants many years ago. Their clothes were torn, stained with dirt and dried blood, and their stomachs growled in protest. By the evening of the second day, the city appeared before them. It was surrounded by a tall stone wall, covered in moss. Behind it, the sharp roofs of houses were visible, narrow streets winding between buildings, and the spires of an ancient temple darkened by time. A thick fog hung over the city, giving it a sinister appearance. "Is this it?" Caleb asked hoarsely. The hunter nodded. "Avern, the Witch City." They approached the massive gates. 2 guards in dark cloaks blocked their way. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, but yellow eyes gleamed from under the fabric. "Outsiders?" one of them asked in a low voice. "We've come for help," the hunter replied. The guards exchanged glances, then stepped aside. "Enter. But remember, in Avern, no unnecessary questions are asked." A chill ran down Caleb's spine. This city felt foreign. The air was thick with ancient magic, slippery, invisible, but palpable. They entered. The city was gloomy. People in hoods moved silently. Their faces were pale, and their eyes glowed in the dim light. There were almost no lights on the streets except for the faint green flames of lanterns. "We need to find the chief witch," the hunter whispered. "And where do we find her?" Edgar muttered, glancing around. "In the temple." They walked down narrow streets, trying not to stare at the strange inhabitants of the city. Witches, warlocks, and ordinary mortals tied to magic watched them, but didn't interfere. The temple stood in the center of the city. It was a majestic structure made of black stone, its walls covered with ancient writings. They entered. The air smelled of herbs and wax. Candles lined the walls, and in the center of the hall, surrounded by shadows, stood a tall figure. "I've been expecting you," a cold voice said. A woman emerged from the darkness. Her long gray hair cascaded down her shoulders, and her eyes were black, without pupils. "You've brought a curse with you," she said. "The swamp has not let you go. It's inside you." Caleb clenched his fists. "How do we get rid of it?" The woman smiled. "You'll have to make a choice. Either you sacrifice something precious, or you become part of the curse forever." Edgar frowned. "What do you mean?" The witch stepped closer. "One of you must stay in the swamp. Only then can the others be freed." Silence fell. Caleb looked at the hunter. The hunter looked at Edgar. "We just escaped from there," Caleb said slowly. "But the swamp doesn't forget," the witch whispered. Shadows around them stirred. They would have to make a decision, and they had little time. The artifact of the cursed. The silence in the temple grew heavier, as if the night itself had descended on their shoulders. Caleb and Edgar looked at the witch, fists clenched, ready to fight if needed. But instead of arguing, the hunter slowly pulled the artifact from his chest. It was a stone, roughly shaped, covered with ancient symbols that glowed with a faint blue light. "This might help us," he said, holding the artifact in his palm. The witch slowly approached, her black eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Where did you find this?" "In the heart of the swamp," the hunter replied, "where the strength of the guardian collapsed." The woman extended her hand, but didn't touch the artifact, as if listening to it. "This is not just a stone," she finally said. "This is the heart of the curse." Caleb frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means that the curse is no longer in the swamp. It's here, in this stone." Edgar exchanged a look with Caleb. "And what do we do now?" The witch smiled. "You have two choices. The first is to return it to the swamp, but it will demand a sacrifice. The second," she looked at the hunter, then at the artifact, "you can destroy it, but the consequences will be unpredictable." The hunter tightened his grip on the artifact. "If we return it to the swamp, one of us must stay there, right?" The witch nodded. "Such are the laws of the curse. The swamp won't accept its power back so easily." Caleb shook his head. "We won't give anyone up." Edgar clenched his fists. "Then there's only one option left." The hunter looked at the witch. "What happens if we break the stone?" A dark gleam flickered in her eyes. "The swamp will die, but not just it." Caleb frowned. "Explain." "This is ancient magic. The swamp is connected to the earth, to the forests, to nature itself. By destroying the artifact, you sever the connection between the curse and this world. The swamp will dry up, but its shadows, they may find a new home." There was a pause. "A new home?" Edgar asked again. "The curse doesn't just disappear," the witch stepped closer. "It may take root in you, or in the city." Caleb grimaced. "So what do we do? Just leave it?" "No," the witch said quietly. "You must choose where to destroy it." The hunter thought for a moment. "Can we break it here in the city?" "Yes. But its shadows will be here. And if it's in the forest? Then the curse will be in the earth, in the trees." Caleb looked at Edgar. "We need a place where magic can't take root." Edgar nodded. "The stone mountains. There's no life there." The witch thought for a moment. "That might work, but you need to be fast. Once the stone cracks, the darkness will try to escape." Caleb took the artifact from the hunter and hid it in a bag. "Then we're heading to the mountains." The witch looked at them one last time. "May luck be on your side." They left the temple, and behind them, the shadows stirred, watching every step they took. The rite of destruction. The journey to the stone mountains took 3 days. They walked without rest, knowing that every hour of delay gave the curse more power. The nights grew longer, and the sounds of the forest increasingly resembled the whispers of swamp ghosts. Finally, the gray peaks rose before them. The stones were cold, lifeless, and the wind howled between the rocks, as if warning of what was to come. "This is it," Caleb said, pulling out the artifact. He placed it on a flat rock. "Ready?" Edgar nodded. The hunter drew a knife. We'll need blood to sever the connection. He made a cut on his hand and spilled a few drops onto the stone. The darkness inside the artifact stirred.
Now,
Caleb shouted. Edgar slammed the stone down onto the artifact. There was a loud crack. Black smoke shot out from the stone, writhing in the air. It took the form of hands, faces, shadows of the past. They reached for them, trying to grab hold, but the wind blew them away. The earth trembled. Caleb grabbed Edgar by the shoulder.
Run.
They bolted downhill, leaving behind the curse that was ripping through the sky. Soon, nothing was left but silence. They had done it. The curse was gone. The return. They returned to the city a week later. The swamp had dried up. Where the rotten water once was, now stretched barren lands, covered with dead trees. Ivern had changed. The city seemed to have been cleansed. The witches were less gloomy, the air was fresh, and even the lantern light seemed brighter. When they entered the temple, the witch met them with a smile. You did it. Yes, Caleb answered tiredly. But what now? Edgar asked. The witch looked out the window. Now you are free. Caleb sighed. Free. But would they ever be able to forget what they saw in the swamp? A new path. Caleb, Edgar, and the hunter stood before the temple, looking at the city that was beginning to come back to life. But something kept Caleb restless. The curse was gone, but the shadows of the past were still nearby. In their memories, in the chill of the night air, in the feeling that someone was watching them. We need to move on, Caleb said, turning to the hunter. We were searching for the artifact, but our main goal is the amulet for Chloe. Edgar nodded. If everything the witch said is true, it could help her control her transformations. The hunter looked at them silently. Will you come with us?
Caleb asked.
The hunter thought for a moment. The curse is destroyed, but magic doesn't disappear without a trace. If your amulet holds the same power that was in the artifact, it could become not a salvation, but a new threat. Caleb frowned. We can't leave Chloe. She's not to blame for what happened to her. I didn't say I was refusing, the hunter smirked. I'll come, but if I feel that the amulet brings evil, I will destroy it, even if you don't like it. Edgar looked at Caleb. We need him. We've seen what he can do. Caleb nodded. Then let's pack. The witch said the amulet is in the Forgotten Valley. The hunter snorted. Great place. No one ever returns from there alive. The Forgotten Valley. Their path led them through old roads once traveled by caravans, but now only desolation reigned. With each passing day, the air grew heavier and the nights colder. It felt as though time itself had frozen here, turning the road into an endless journey. On the third day of their travels, they saw smoke on the horizon. Someone's there, Edgar said. Maybe a caravan? Caleb suggested, but the hunter shook his head.
Too quiet.
They cautiously moved forward. When they reached the camp, a chilling sight greeted them. The fires were still smoldering, but there were no people. Things were scattered around, and there were bloodstains on the ground. They didn't leave, the hunter said softly, inspecting the ground. They were taken. Caleb felt something cold run down his spine. Who? The hunter straightened up and pointed to the far edge of the camp.
Look.
On the sand, huge tracks could be seen. Not human. Something dark and ancient had moved across these lands, and it knew they were there. Tracks in the darkness. Caleb, Edgar, and the hunter stood among the ransacked camp, feeling the sinister presence of something invisible. This isn't just a beast, the hunter said quietly, touching the tracks on the ground. They're too deep. Something heavy moved here, but it didn't quite touch the ground. Levitation? Edgar suggested. The hunter nodded. Or a semi-ghostly entity. Caleb looked around the camp. The scattered belongings, the smoldering embers. Everything pointed to a sudden disappearance of the people. Did they scream? He asked. The hunter shook his head. No signs of panic. That means they were taken quickly.
Or hypnotized.
Edgar looked at the far end of the camp, where the tracks disappeared into the dark thickets. We need to find out who did this. The hunter inspected the ground again. We move cautiously. If we're spotted, we'll be next. They moved ahead, following the tracks into the darkness. The shadow behind the trees. The deeper they went into the forest, the quieter the world became. Even the wind stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Caleb felt the tension in the air, as though his body was warning him of danger. Edgar walked beside him, gripping the hilt of his sword. The hunter walked ahead, his eyes fixed on the tracks.
Suddenly he stopped.
This way. They found themselves at a ravine, where the tracks suddenly stopped. They disappeared? Edgar asked in surprise. No. The hunter pointed downward. Caleb looked into the ravine. Below, something was shining in the moonlight. They carefully descended. At the bottom of the ravine lay torn pieces of clothing, ragged strips, weapons with dried blood, but no bodies. And in the center of all this horror, there was a strange object, a translucent stone glowing with a ghostly light. Caleb reached for it, but the hunter sharply grabbed his hand. Don't touch it. What is it? Edgar whispered. The answer to all the questions, the hunter said grimly. But if we take it, they might notice us. Caleb gritted his teeth. We need that stone. He looked around. The forest was too quiet, and then he realized the silence wasn't natural. It was the harbinger of something already watching them from the darkness. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further translations. Eyes in the dark. Caleb slowly straightened up, his fingers no longer reaching for the stone. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, not out of fear, but from realization. We're not alone, he whispered. Edgar gripped the hilt of his sword tighter, without turning his head. Where? Everywhere, the hunter rasped. There was something invisible but tangible in the air. Tension, cold, a sense of foreign presence. They couldn't see the enemy, but they could hear its breath in the night. Caleb took a step back. We need to leave. But at that moment, the forest came alive. The darkness between the trees shifted, outlining tall, twisted silhouettes. They seemed woven from shadows, but faintly glimmered, reflecting the moonlight.
Eyes.
Dozens of eyes flared in the dark. White, without pupils, blind yet still staring intently at them.
Shadows.
Edgar whispered. Caleb understood. These beings were echoes of the curse they had broken. Fragments of pain, unable to find a new home. Run, the hunter ordered. But it was too late. The shadows lunged forward. The hunt. The first strike hit Edgar. A force slammed into his chest, sending him flying back, crashing to the ground. Caleb drew a dagger, but the shadows had no form. Hitting them was impossible.
Fire.
The hunter shouted, pulling a torch from his bag. He lit it, and the dim light pierced the darkness. The creatures howled, retreating, but not vanishing. It won't stop them, Caleb exhaled, helping Edgar to his feet. We need to get to the stone, the hunter shouted. They rushed toward the glowing artifact. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed it. The world exploded. Blinding light flooded from the stone, causing the shadows to recoil. They screamed, their silhouettes distorting, trembling, dissolving. The air around them vibrated, the forest trembled, and suddenly, there was silence. Caleb slowly lowered his hand. The stone dimmed. The shadows vanished. Edgar got to his feet, clutching his ribs. What was that? The hunter ran a hand over his face. They came for the stone. Caleb looked at the dull artifact. It was feeding them. Now it's empty. So, is the danger over? Edgar asked. The hunter shook his head. No. The stone is a key. The question is, what door does it open? Caleb clenched his fingers. They had cleansed the swamp. But what if the curse wasn't gone? What if they had just released it into the world? Return to the lair. Caleb felt a surge of anxiety rising inside him. He spun toward Edgar and the hunter. We don't have time to think or figure things out. We need to get to the lair, to Chloe. We left her alone. And the shadows. He gritted his teeth. They might have found her. Edgar immediately understood what he meant. Damn, he breathed. If the curse was really tied to this stone, it might have spread to Chloe. Caleb was already moving. We can't waste a second. They sprinted through the forest. Their steps echoed on the cold ground, their breaths coming in clouds of steam. The wind picked up, as if the world knew something was coming. Caleb didn't feel tired. In his mind, one voice rang out. Hurry, before it's too late. Traces of chaos. By the time they reached the lair, night was nearly giving way to dawn. But the silence that enveloped the area was ominous. Caleb gripped the hilt of his sword and entered first. Chloe. No answer. He rushed forward. The room where they had left her looked empty. Torn fabrics lay on the floor. The cold hearth only exuded a faint scent of smoke. But the worst was yet to come. The walls were scratch deep, scratches that could only have been made by... She changed again, Edgar whispered, following him in. The hunter slowly surveyed the room. Something else was here. Caleb turned to him. What do you mean? The hunter pointed to the floor. Claw marks, but not hers. They're smaller.
What?
Edgar immediately tensed. Caleb looked at the marks. They were indeed different from Chloe's. Shadows. They were here. But where is she? Edgar's voice grew more tense. Caleb didn't want to say it out loud. But only one explanation came to mind. They took her.
Chapter 17.
To chase the silence in the room hung heavily. Caleb clenched his fists. Well, find her. The hunter nodded, carefully inspecting the marks on the floor. They couldn't have gone far. But the problem is... What? Edgar asked. The hunter looked at them.
She went with them.
Caleb froze. What did you say? The hunter slowly crouched, touching the marks. Look, he traced his finger along the floor, showing where the prints led. Her tracks show no resistance. Edgar frowned. But why? Caleb gritted his teeth. Because the curse found a new vessel in her. The words of the witch echoed in his mind. The curse doesn't disappear. It only seeks a new home. And now, it seemed that home was Chloe. We need to catch up with her before she vanishes completely, Caleb said firmly. They burst out of the lair, following the trail of marks. But with every step, Caleb's dread grew. What if they were already too late? The forest of shadows. The tracks led them deeper into the forest. The air grew thicker, the trees taller, and the moonlight barely pierced through the dark canopy. Here, in this place, something was changing. Caleb felt it. We're getting close, Edgar whispered. They burst into a small clearing and froze. In the middle of the clearing stood Chloe. But this was no longer the Chloe they knew. Her eyes glowed with a ghostly blue light. Her skin had darkened slightly, and her claws had lengthened. Darkness swirled around her, faintly pulsing in the air. She stared at them, but she didn't recognize them. Chloe, Caleb said quietly, taking a step forward. She blinked. Caleb? For a moment, her voice was the same. But then the world shook. Black shadows erupted from the ground, twisting around her. And then Caleb understood. She no longer controlled herself. The ghostly essence trapped in the artifact had found a new vessel in her. She's one of them, Edgar whispered. Caleb didn't wait. We won't lose her. He drew his sword. Get ready. The darkness growled. The battle began. The call of the pack. The darkness around Chloe thickened like a hungry beast ready to consume all life. Caleb gripped his sword, and Edgar and the hunter took positions on either side. But before they could move, a low, guttural growl came from the trees. The shadows stirred, as if sensing something.
What?
Caleb spun around, and then they emerged from the woods. Werewolves. Tall, strong figures glided through the twilight, their eyes glowing with amber light. Their fur shimmered in the moonlight, claws gleaming. They moved silently, gracefully, surrounding the clearing. Leading them was a mighty wolf with thick dark fur and eyes full of ancient power, the alpha of the pack. And beside him, Caleb needed a moment to realize. His younger brother, Leonard, was among them. Tall, with silvery gray fur, he stepped forward, shifting from wolf form to human. But Caleb didn't let him finish. Anger flared in his chest like a flame. He stepped forward, looking into the alpha's eyes. Empty heads. Where were you? His voice thundered across the clearing. How is it possible that Chloe was taken? The alpha, a tall werewolf with thick black fur, sighed but didn't look away. We came as soon as we could. As soon as you could. Caleb clenched his fists. Enough excuses. Leo stepped closer. We didn't know. You should have known. Caleb bared his teeth. She's your pack. You should have protected her. The alpha and the elders exchanged glances. They couldn't offer any excuses. But now is not the time for quarrels. We're here to fix our mistake, the alpha finally said. Caleb growled but didn't argue. Then fight. The darkness writhed, and the battle began. Chapter 20. The battle for Chloe. The shadows howled, attacking from all sides. The alpha moved first. A massive black wolf leaped straight into the heart of the shadows, tearing at them with its claws. Leo followed, his silver fur flashing in the dark as he jumped toward Chloe. We need to pull her out, he shouted. Edgar fired his crossbow, a precise bolt piercing the ghostly essence, causing it to shriek. The hunter fought alongside, his silver blades flashing in the dark, tearing through enemies. But Chloe, she stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by a whirlwind of shadow. Caleb fought his way through the battle, ignoring the wounds, not hearing the screams. Chloe, she turned. For a moment, her eyes were as they once were. Caleb, she whispered. The shadows swirled around her, trying to pull her back. Caleb leaped forward, grabbing her hand. You won't go. Leo rushed to him, grabbing Chloe's other hand. Pull. The werewolves, Edgar, and the hunter fought around them, fending off more and more shadows. Caleb gritted his teeth. Chloe, fight. Her body trembled, light and darkness battling inside her. But then, Chloe screamed. A wave of magic burst from her, scattering the darkness around. The werewolves recoiled, and then the shadows vanished. Chloe collapsed into Caleb's arms. Are you okay? He squeezed her hand. She opened her eyes, no longer glowing blue. Yes, the swamp was defeated. The shadows dissipated, and Chloe was saved. But at what cost? Chapter 21. Consequences. The forest was quiet again. The werewolves stood around, breathing heavily. Leo wiped the blood from his face. Is she free? The alpha nodded. The curse is broken. Edgar looked around. What now? Caleb looked at Chloe. She smiled tiredly. Now we live. They had won the battle, but there was still so much unknown ahead. The end, or just the beginning?